who is only 25 years old today. Happy birthday, Pastor Joseph.
Hey guys, I'm actually going to start us off with a little video, so let me get that up for you. All right. One second.
Sometimes people closest to you.
Did you guys hear it? You hear anything?
So I want you to promise me something, okay? Leave Gwen out of it. Promise me that. Huh? You promise me. Oh.
Okay. Right there. We've got one more actually.
One. Who am I? Mr. Parker. Tardy again. Well, at least we can always count on you.
Sorry, Miss Ritter, won't happen again, I promise.
Don't make promises you can't keep, Mr. Parker.
Yeah, but those are the best kind.
I'm going to stop this right there too. Today we're going to be talking about the generations of Adam. From the video that we saw, from the little clip that we saw, if any of you haven't watched the movie yet, it is The Amazing Spider-Man. And what happens at the end of the movie after the villain is defeated, the police chief is on his last breath. And he makes Peter Parker promise him that no matter what happens, not to include his daughter Gwen Stacy into all his heroic stuff. But then as we see in the next clip, he goes and says, you know, the promises that you can't keep, those are the best ones to make. And it's kind of funny, but every one of us here has been a victim of a promise that has not been kept. But at the same time, we've also been a perpetrator of a promise that has not been kept. Have we told, you know, our parents that we're going to practice our instruments for a certain amount of time, or do our homework by a certain day? Or maybe at work, your boss promises you that you're going to get a raise or a promotion when this time comes around, but then someone else gets it instead, or you just don't get it. Maybe our friends have asked us to hang out with us, and then after we planned everything, on the day of, they show up super late. Or even worse, they just don't show up at all. Maybe someone has once promised us that they would love us forever, that they will always be by our side. And then when the going gets tough, they disappear. We've all been victims of people who've broken promises to us. And we've all been people who have broken promises with others. Today, as we read Genesis chapter 5, we're not going to just see all the different patriarchs or the different people that Faith just read for us. But what I want us to recognize from this is that God keeps his promises. As we read through the chapter 5 of Genesis, I want us to see that God continues to keep his promises with us. And so let's see. First, I want to give you guys a little bit of background. We had just gone through Genesis 1 to 4. And in chapters 1 to 2, God has just created everything in the world. Man, woman, animals, sun, moon. Then in Genesis chapter 3, man and woman decides to take fruit from the one tree that God told them not to take from. In taking it, they disobeyed God and sin entered into the world. So they had to be kicked out from the garden. They couldn't stay there anymore. Then in chapter 4, what happens is that God blesses Eve with a son. Well, not just one. He blesses him with two. So she has Cain and she has Abel. And it's the best time of Eve's life. She's praising God. She's thanking him for blessing her with this child, because children was a blessing after the curse. But as we know, if you continue reading in Genesis chapter 4, Cain kills his brother Abel. Cain commits the first murder and is sent out from God's presence. And then we see in Genesis chapter 4 a bunch of Cain's children who are born and all that stuff. Now we're in Genesis chapter 5. Genesis chapter 5 begins with, this is the book of the generations of Adam. Now, if you ever see this in the book of Genesis, you'll know this appears more than just once. Because the book of Genesis constantly talks about the different generations. Actually, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to teach you all a Hebrew word. The word is Toledoth. So I taught the youths this word, and I'm going to teach everyone here. Toledoth stands for generations, and within the book of Genesis, there are 10 such Toledoths. Of those 10, there are 3 that talk about the numbers of years someone has lived, or how long they lived before they died. And we're going to focus now on Adam. All the kids that came out from Adam, from Seth, all the way down to the next generation. This is where our focus is on. And so Adam's the first person. What happens to him? He lives 130 years, and then after that, he fathers a son named Seth. Now Seth was in his own likeness, in his own image. If any of you remember from Genesis chapter 1, or just the last 2 verses, God makes man in his image. So do this little math problem with me right now. If God made man and woman in his likeness, and Adam fathered Seth, who was in his likeness, then technically speaking, by the transitive property, Seth was also in God's likeness. You see, what we see here, the reason why the author has to make sure that we know that Seth was in Adam's image was so that we remembered and continue to know that God's likeness will still be carried on through his people. That God's likeness, after Adam, still continued to Seth, then to his children, and even down to us. That's why we have to recognize each and every one of us here does have God's image. But what happens after this? We see from verses 6 to 32, here's all the hard and difficult names to pronounce. Faith did a really good job, so we're going to look at the names in a bit. But this is the structure, right? This is what happens. First, this person is alive. He gives birth to this person after a certain amount of years, and then he has a bunch more children, and then after a certain amount of time, he dies. This is the same structure that we see for the next 8 patriarchs. So Adam to Seth, to Enosh, to Kenan, to Mahalalel, to Jared, to Enoch, to Methuselah, Lamech, to Noah. Each and every person is born, gives birth to another child, gives birth to a bunch more children, and then dies. That's what we see right now. But this is also the first promise that I want us to recognize that God keeps. If you guys remember back in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28, God had just made man and woman, and then he promised and blessed them. He said, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it. This promise, this blessing has not been forgotten. If you remember, Eve just lost both her sons. She's probably thinking, what am I going to do? What is going to happen? How are we still supposed to fill the earth? Seth is the answer to that promise. God remembers and continues to bless them one child after the next, until there's more than they can count. God remembered the blessing and the promise that he gave to Eve, and he brought it to fruition. But in the same way as God remembers his blessings, God also remembers the punishment that he gave his people. See, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, he told Adam that one day you will return to the ground. That all human beings will turn to dust because that's where they came from. And we see that throughout the whole passage of Genesis chapter 5. Every single time it says, and he died. He lived for some years and he died. Every single patriarch and every person afterwards in all of history has to experience this, except Enoch. He's a little special, but we're going to talk about him later. But if you look at the timeline, you see this nice little, everybody started at some point, but each and every one of them inevitably dies. See, God keeps his promises with his people. The blessings that he's given them, but also the punishments and the curses. He doesn't just forget like our friends or our family members do. He remembers, and he will carry it out faithfully. But that's not all. Because now what I want us to focus in on is the two people that are different out of this whole genealogy. The first one is Lamech. He doesn't just say, oh, he lived and then he died after having some kids. After he has Noah, he says this nice little line, out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. Now, what made Lamech any different than any of the previous patriarchs? Why did he have suddenly get this revelation to say this? Now, maybe, part of it is God probably spoke to him, right? That's what usually happens. God talks to people, and then they get things. But let's look at this timeline. If you can see the numbers. Between the time that Lamech was born and when he gave birth to Noah, two very big things happened within this short time period. If you haven't noticed yet, Adam and Seth passes away. In between the time from Lamech to Noah, the original two patriarchs has passed away. The first time any patriarch has passed away was during Lamech's time. Can you imagine what's going through his head? All throughout their lives, all these patriarchs and family members are just coming together to celebrate. And for the first time, Adam and Seth doesn't show up. For the first time, someone dies not from murder, from natural causes. At this point, Lamech is remembering the curses that God had given them. He's remembering the fact that all those tiring years of working the field, but also the curse that God said that man will one day return to the dust. And so in his grief, in his pain, he probably cried out to God, and hence he wanted Noah to be the relief. But as we know, Noah wasn't the one who ends up bringing redemption. But what does happen to Noah? If you guys read in chapter 6 and 7 of Genesis, you realize that Noah's family is the only one that survives the flood. He's the only one out of everyone on earth who survives the flood and then continues on the generations. This is God's answer to Eve. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, he says, I will put enmity between you and the woman. God is cursing the serpent, but also showing that at one point in the future, one of Eve's offsprings will one day crush the head of serpent forever. One day in the future, someone will come from Eve's lineage who will forever rid the world of evil. Noah surviving is part of that promise, because what happens is from Adam, we got all the way down to Noah. Then we have Abraham. Then somewhere down the line, we have King David. And all the way, many, 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 many years later, Jesus. And Jesus isn't just some random person that came along. See, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and Romans chapter 5, Paul is telling the churches, because of Adam's sin, because of what he's done, death is part of our lives. Each and every one of us today will one day have to face that because of what Adam has done. But what Paul reminds us here is a continuation of the promise that God had given, that Jesus Christ, through his death, through his obedience, through his righteousness and his grace, life has entered. The promise that he had given to Eve was being fulfilled through Jesus. And that promise isn't just for the people of that day, because it is for each and every one of us. See, God doesn't just keep his promises throughout this old book of the Bible that we're reading, but God keeps his promises to each and every one of us that are sitting in these pews and everyone outside as well. God promises us to provide. We see in Psalm, we see in Philippians, God continues to provide for us. Maybe it's the food that you have when you go home to eat, the home that you live in, the place you get to live in. Maybe it's the clothes that are on your back right now. Or maybe for some of us, we see God's provision through our friends, our family members that walk through life with us. God continues to provide. He promises to protect us. The very fact that each and every one of you are sitting here today is a testimony to how he's brought you through your injuries, your illnesses, your traumas, your drama. God has walked with you through each and every one of them and still protected you to this day. God also promises his presence with us. You see, when Jesus went back to heaven, way back in Matthew, he said that he will be with us always through the Holy Spirit. Each and every one of you here who has accepted Jesus into your hearts has the very presence of God within you every single moment. Lastly, I want to bring up that God promises us justice. Now, some of us, this is what we're waiting for. For God to get rid of all the bullies in the world, to get rid of all the discrimination, all the segregation, all the unfairness, everything that's just not right. God promises justice. And maybe some of us have seen sprinklings of it throughout our life, but a lot of it is still present in our world. But you see, Jesus doesn't end there. Jesus' story doesn't end there because he doesn't just die and rise again. He says that one day in the future, he will come back and judgment will happen. Justice will be served. And God's promise to us is that one day in the future, there is hope for justice to be served. God doesn't just keep his promises with his people. He keeps his promise with each and every one of us. He is faithful and fulfills everything that he says he will do in our lives. So then what are we to do? You see, such a promise, such love, such faithfulness deserves a response. So what is our response then? Remember how I told you that Genesis chapter 5 tells us to focus in on how God keeps his promises. I want us to see now that Genesis chapter 5 also points to one person, one very special man. That man is Enoch. Now, Enoch also, different than all the other patriarchs, he gets a few extra words in his structure. God says, or the author writes, that Enoch walked with God. He says this twice. And because Enoch walked with God, he got to avoid death. Every other patriarch dies, except for this man. He gets beamed up into heaven or something. He doesn't have to die. And if that's not enough to tell us that the author's trying to focus on him, the author does something else. If you look through every single word in the Hebrew text of Genesis chapter 5, you'll notice, or you might notice, that there's exactly 365 words in Genesis chapter 5. You see, back then for the Jewish people, they had to memorize their text. That's how they transferred it, or they transferred it to one person to the next. So they would have known exactly how many words each chapter, each book had. And so imagine what they thought when they read this one, and they're like, wait a second, Enoch lived 365 years? And the author specifically made this chapter have only 365 words? If that's not a big red arrow pointing back to Enoch, then I don't know what is. Genesis 5 demands us to look at Enoch because of the way he lived. He walked with God. He walked with God. And this is the way that God intended it. And this is the way that he wants us to respond. Walking with him. Now, how do we do that? It's easy to say, right? It's easy for us to say, all we need to do is follow God. All we need to do is talk to him some more. All we need to do is just live the way that Jesus lived. How do we walk with God daily? I think what we see here is that Enoch had a very intimate relationship with God. God wasn't just somebody he called up every now and then to talk. God wasn't just somebody that he prayed so that his crops would grow. God was someone that he knew and he loved. And so one way I think that we can be challenged to walk with God daily is to love him. Now, how many of you here have taken knows what the 5 love languages are and taken the test for the 5 love languages? I think most of you here should have a general idea of what the 5 love languages are, right? So we have acts of service, we have words of affirmation, quality time, gifts, physical touch. Now, when you take that test, what it does is it tells you how you best receive love. What is the best way that you want people to love you? But now the question is, how do you show love? What is your best way in showing someone else that you love them? I'm going to ask now, and this is the one time in my sermon where I'm going to ask for volunteers and ask, for you guys, how do you best show other people love? I'm going to start with Pastor Paul. Okay, acts of service. Yes, Jacob. Yeah. Andrew? Physical touch. Nice. Yes? Sorry. And don't yell at the, I can see how that could be slightly related to words of affirmation. Anyone else? Yeah? Quality time. The thing is, we all show love differently, and we're all good at showing love in different ways. Just ask your friends, and they'll tell you if you've been good at it or not, or your wife, or whatever. But the thing is, we all show love differently. Now, what if we were to use the way that we show love to other people to love God? What if we were to love God in the ways that we love other people best? So for those of you who love with acts of service, what if you were to serve God, serve his people, serve the world, serve his church? For those of you who say your love language is words of affirmation, what if you were to praise God with your words, to worship him, to glorify him daily? For those of you who say your love language to give is quality time, what if you were to spend time communicating with God, understanding him, really getting to know who he is, being in prayer, reading his word? For those of you who say that gifts is your love language to give, are we giving back to those in need, to the church, to its ministries, to the people that God has a passion for, the oppressed, the poor? Now, physical touch. This is the hard one. God's not someone you can just touch like this and just, that's not how it works. But what we do see, and what God has told us, is that in each and every person is his likeness. In creation, you can see God. What if we loved God by experiencing his presence in his creation and his people? What if we loved God by respecting, by loving, by honoring the world, the environment, our friends? Each and every one of us knows how to love people. Some are one way, some are the other. Whichever way it is that you love, my challenge is that you love God with that way. Start with that, and then you can work your way through the rest of them. See, this is Genesis chapter 5, a book full of difficult to pronounce names, a book full of lineages of years and all that stuff. And yet it shows us God's faithfulness. The God continues to keep his promises. That he'll be faithful to his people and he'll be faithful to you. So respond. Walk with him daily. Learn how to love him one step at a time. Know that God is faithful and respond by walking with him. Let's pray. Father, we know that you've brought each and every one of us here for a reason. And we thank you for our parents, our grandparents, great-grandparents. Because of them, we can be here. But Lord, all of that comes back to you. And so we ask that you would teach us how to love you better. Lord, you've shown us that we can love other people in our different ways. So teach us how to love you as you have always loved us. We pray all this in your Son's name.